A problem that comes up all the time with my students and Patreon supporters, and certainly also something that I remember from learning myself, is that after a lot of practice, then you find yourself at a point where you know the scales and arpeggios, and you understand how that fits with the progression, but your solos still sound like this. Which is not how jazz sounds, and you can hear that yourself as well, especially if you start comparing it to the phrases in the solos that you listen to that inspire you. But if focusing on playing the right notes is a mistake, then how do you fix this? Now, clearly something is missing, and you don't want to only focus on the dry theory stuff. So in this video, you can take a closer look at what great players like Barry Harris and Charlie Parker are doing, and then you can get started working on making it sound right. Because some of it is not about the notes. Good jazz lines have a certain energy, and this is really coming from bebop, where there's a lot of forward motion. Take an example like this Barry Harris line from his solo on I Remember April. It's pretty easy to hear that he's playing from one chord to the next and has lines that move to a target note in the next chord. And in this case, I took an example where the target notes are placed sort of conveniently clear on the heavy beats of the bar, but you can open that up later. This is from his Live in Tokyo album, which is definitely worth checking out. His playing on this is fantastic. What you want to avoid is that your melodies have a lot of notes but are not going anywhere. This is not a fantastic bebop line. This doesn't work because there's no direction. It's just moving back and forth and not really locking in with the flow of the chords. And you want to be able to make lines that move forward. You want to feel that the melody is going to hit that target note on the next chord, and your solo lines should be saying,
"We're on a mission from God."
What do we need? If we take Barry Harris' lick as an example, then you can see that he is hitting chord tones on the heavy beats, and that's an easy way to get started, because then you can really hear that you're connecting with the harmony and that you're playing those changes. The other thing that you want to get in there is that you want to get used to playing melodies that are moving towards that target note, because that's what's going to give you that flow, that energy that you want to have in there. Let's say that you have a quick 2-5-1 in C major and these target notes. Third, and fifth. And now you want to make lines that move towards a target note. From D-7 to G7, you can just run down the scale. Super easy, barely an inconvenience. To change things up a bit on the G7, we have 3 notes to get to C major 7, and you can do that by just playing a D minor triad that naturally resolves to that G on C major 7. And then you have... If you start practicing making lines like this, then you will start to get more of that bebop energy or momentum into your solos. Think of where you want to go and play a line that gets you there. The next thing to work on is something that I sort of skipped over in the Barry Harris example. Notice how he's using chromatic notes to get more tension and in that way pull the melody forward. And this can really help with the energy and is a key part of the bebop or jazz sound. And I'm going to show you more concepts like this along the way in the video. Again, it's something you probably want to mostly think of as moving to a specific note, and usually there will also be a note in the chord at that point, so a chord tone. Check out how this Charlie Parker lick from his solo on Cherokee is really pushing through to the resolution and has some great chromatic phrases as well. It mostly makes sense to split these into 2 types, single chromatic notes and the other type, which is a longer chromatic melody, usually approaching the target note from above and below. We call those chromatic enclosures. Adding this to your playing is really about learning to add chromatic notes and learning some chromatic enclosures that you then start to add to your lines. And the target notes for the chromatic phrases are often going to be the chord tones that you would anyway use as target notes in your solo. An example of how you can do this with an enclosure on the D-7 and 2 passing notes on the G7 sounds like this. As you can tell by now, then I'm showing you the concepts that are being used by Parker and Barry Harris, and actually also later Joe Pass. But how do you get those into your playing? Now, if you want to play better lines and you want to add a specific type of phrase into your playing, then you should really work on composing or writing lines. This is not something that I made up. If you study Parker's solo, then he clearly has phrases that he uses a lot, and he probably wrote or composed those and started using them. And the Barry Harris masterclasses are really just mostly about him showing the students how he composes solo phrases while breaking down the concepts that he's using. And that is also what you should do. If you want to become better at using F major triads over a D minor 7 chord, then write 50 2-5-1 licks in C major that use that triad. Then you cover 3 of the most important parts of getting that into your playing. How it sounds, and also how you get it into your ears. How you want it to sound so that you can compose and control that things actually sound good, that you can make lines that you like the sound of, and also that it is playable, so that you're sure that you can actually play those phrases, that it makes sense, that you're practicing something that you will actually be able to use. You don't need to always write down what you're composing, the licks that you're coming up with, but it can be a really good idea, especially if you want to figure out why something sounds good, or maybe if it sounds bad. I'll show you how I work with this later in the video. Now you have a better idea about how to create lines that move forward, but there are other ways to make your solo lines come more alive and be less mechanical or robotic.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
And they're actually pretty easy to start using. One way is to play arpeggios as triplets, to add short, rapid phrases to lines that are for the rest mostly eighth notes. And this is really just about changing up the flow and creating some variation. Check out this Joe Pass line where he does that in 2 different ways. Joe Pass is playing the arpeggios as eighth note triplets, and here you have a B flat major 7 arpeggio with a leading note which leads nicely into an enclosure. And later he's using an A minor 7 arpeggio, also played as a triplet, but now without the leading note, and he's using it to target the note F. Both techniques are very common ways to use triplets and can be applied to all chords. They are a great way to change up the flow and get to a target note. You can also see Barry Harris using this in that example here on the G major 7 chord. He's using both B minor 7 and G major 7 arpeggios. Practicing to play your scales in diatonic arpeggios using these 2 recipes is really a great exercise, and that's also something that can really help you getting started using this in your solos. But there is another great device in this example that can really help you break up the eighth note flow, especially if you have too many scale runs in your solos. If you listen to the first part of the line, then in the second bar, Joe Pass plays a trill, which really breaks up what is going on and stops it from just being a descending scale run, because without it, you would just have this. Joe Pass loves using these and often uses several after each other. But they are the kind of thing that you want to add to a solo in the practical places, so places where they're easy to play, simply because they're pretty fast and usually sounds the best if you can execute them with the gato technique. If you can't do that, then they're just going to get unplayable and not very practical. Barry uses them as well, as you can hear in this example. Here you see the trill on the dominant chord leading into the root of F7, and this example illustrates another really powerful technique that I'll get into in a bit as well. And I can use that to show you how I compose lines to get something into my playing. What I'm talking about here is the first arpeggio in the example, which is a pivot arpeggio. Something that can really solve a lot of problems if your solo lines are very predictable and tend to just run up and down scales and arpeggios. In this case, it's an E flat major 7 arpeggio over a C minor 7 chord, so using the arpeggio from the third of the chord. To construct a pivot arpeggio, then you take an arpeggio, in this case E flat major 7, you play the root, and then you move down the rest of the arpeggio an octave to get this much more interesting melody with a large interval skip. And don't underestimate just how powerful it is to have a way to make large intervals melodic in a solo, because they can very easily sound very unnatural when you try to put them in there. When you want to get better at using something like a pivot arpeggio, then try to keep it as simple as possible when you're composing lines. One phrase, or in this case, just one arpeggio, one chord to apply it to. So for now, I'm just going to stick to using the E flat major 7 pivot arpeggio on a C minor 7 chord, and one way of playing it. And that's because you can easily get lost in all the different options that are available, but it's not going to be nearly as useful if you're really just focusing on connecting one way of playing this arpeggio to all the other things that you can play in that area of the neck. If I take the E flat major 7 pivot arpeggio and then try to make a line that takes me from C minor 7 to F7, then I can maybe just try to get to that A as a target note on the F7. And I could of course also try to target the A that's an octave higher by combining the pivot arpeggio with a C minor 7 arpeggio. Maybe adding a trill to get to the F7. Or adding a chromatic enclosure and then taking another target note on the F7. From here, you can gradually start to use it when you're soloing because it's already put into phrases and you can actually make something that sounds good. You can start to hear melodies with it. The absolute worst advice that I see is when people ask a specific question online and then get this horrible and lazy answer. Learn from the masters. Now, a funny thing about that advice is that often, in essence, it's actually right, but it's so vague and lazy that it's completely useless. As you can tell from this video, then I am definitely checking out solos to find vocabulary and get ideas. And learning solos by ear is actually one of the best things that you can do for your playing when it comes to figuring out how melodies work, finding new things to play, and definitely also improving your phrasing. But you need to start it the right way so that it isn't impossible to learn the solos. And that is what I cover in this video.